This is Debt Free in 30, where every week we take 30 minutes and get practical advice from industry experts about personal finance and living debt-free. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
One of the most common reasons that people call the Hoyes Michaelis 310 plan helpline is because either their wages are being garnisheed or a creditor is threatening to garnish their wages. We've done a podcast about what steps to take if you have a wage garnishment. Today we'll give a quick reminder of what you can do if you are faced with a wage garnishment, but we'll start by talking about what types of income can be garnisheed and how much of your wages can be garnisheed if you receive a garnishment order. We'll discuss different forms of income, so if you're listening today and you're only interested in one type of income, like wages, and aren't interested in the other forms of income that can be garnisheed, like pensions, well, no problem. I've got you covered. You can go to the show notes over at hoyes.com/podcast and find the show notes for this show. I've created a list of the timestamps for each topic we cover, so you can fast forward to the exact topic you want to hear about. So to help us talk about all things wage garnishment, returning to the show once again, but for the first time this season, is Ted Michaelis, my Hoyes Michaelis co-founder and business partner. And Ted, of course, like me, is a chartered accountant and a licensed insolvency trustee. Ted, welcome back.
Thanks, Doug.
So before we begin, let's address a question that bothers everyone. Is the correct term garnish or garnishee or garnishment?
Okay. Well, so let's look at some definitions and maybe have a little bit of fun. What's a garnish? So a garnish is some sort of decoration or embellishment. You usually think about it when you've got a food out as a presentation. You know, that fancy turkey dinner you see on the TVs with some parsley along the outside, maybe some lettuce, that sort of
Exactly.
stuff.
Parsley. Parsley is a garnish.
Now, on the same token, though, garnish is also a legal term. Which means to serve with a garnishment. So I guess we'll have to talk about what a garnishment is. So you can actually be garnished. How's that for confusing things?
So the answer is all the terms are correct then.
Sure. Okay, we didn't talk about garnishee, which is a funny term. It's generally the one that most legal professionals think of when you're talking about taking a deduction from somebody's wages. You are garnisheeing them. But it's correct to say garnishment, garnishee, to garnish. You're right. It's all right.
It's all right. So that's good. That's good because that's one of the few terms where it doesn't really matter how you use it. Because I get corrected on that all the time. People say, "Oh, well, garnish, that's something you put on your like
it's
you
a pickle,
say on your
right?
yeah, exactly." So, and which is why I typically use the term garnishee, but they're all correct. So okay. So now for the real question: what sources of income can be subject to a garnishment order? So obviously, we help people with many different sources of income. The most common sources of income would be, wages, Ontario Works, disability payments, pensions, and there's even this new basic income that's being piloted in Ontario we can talk about. So let's start with the most obvious source of income, which is wages. And can wages be garnisheed? So in Ontario, we have something called the Wages Act. It's really short. It's only 3 pages long. So we're going to quote from it now. And obviously, if you're listening to this podcast outside of Ontario, Canada, the laws will be different in your area. But the basic concepts in most provinces and states are very similar. So this should still be a good guide for you. But again, we're talking about laws that only apply in Ontario. So, Ted, let's start with the obvious question. Quote me from the Act. What is the definition of wages?
All right. So wages mean wages or salary, whether the employment in respect of which the same is payable by time or by job or by piece or otherwise. So what that means is it's money you're getting paid for working. It doesn't matter if you get paid by the hour or by piecework or by salary. It's all considered wages. You earned the money.
Okay, and that's pretty simple. Something I get paid for working. That's
right.
What wages are. So now you and I both have jobs. And
So
far, depends what we say on this podcast, I guess. We both get a paycheck. I mean, we happen to own the company that pays us, but we do get a paycheck. And as every employee knows, money is deducted from that paycheck. So if I make $15 an hour, I don't get paid the entire $15 because my employer is required to take off money for employment insurance and CPP and income taxes. So when we're talking about wages subject to a garnishment, how do those deductions factor into it?
Okay. So the Act very clearly says that your wages do not include an amount that the employer is required to deduct by law from wages. So that would be your CPP, your EI premiums, any other legally required or statutory deduction from your pay. So if someone's getting a garnishment order against you, your wage, it's on your net pay, or rather your pay net of government deductions.
Your net pay, okay.
Right. That's easy to understand.
Easy to understand. So if I get paid $15 an hour and $1 is coming off, I'm only getting really paid $14 an hour. I can be garnished on the 14, not the 15. Okay,
right.
So the real question, the big question is what percentage, how much of my wages can be garnished?
All right, so this is where the government gets cute. So in the Wages Act, it says, subject to subsection 3, which we'll talk about in a second, 80% of a person's wages are exempt from seizure or garnishment. So instead of saying that they can take 20% of your net pay, they say 80% of your net pay is protected.
Yeah, this is why the government just drives us crazy. But, okay, yeah, so you're right. Why not just say 20%? They can take 20%.
Well, it's easier to understand now. Subsection 3 says that 50% of a person's wages are exempt from seizure or garnishment and the enforcement of a support order. So that means that if you've got a spousal support or a child support order, they can take up to 50% of your next pay.
Okay, so let's do some math here then. So my gross salary is $1,000, and my employer is required to deduct $200 for EI, CPP, and taxes. So normally my net paycheck is $800. What's the maximum that can be garnished?
All right. So for what we're going to call a regular creditor, a normal creditor, an execution creditor, those are all terms that people use, they can take 20% of your net. So if your net is $800, 20% of that is $160, your pay would be $640. Now, if it's a support order, it can be 50% of your net. So if your net is $800, 50% of that is $400, you'd receive $400 in pay.
Okay,
There's another twist, though.
So tell me the other twist then.
Okay, so the other twist is that the court has the right to adjust those exemptions up or down. So effectively, anytime something's in court, judges have discretion that they can say, well, the 20% isn't fair, you can afford more, or that's too much. And so you just got to keep in mind that the vast majority of the times, 20% is the limit for an execution creditor, somebody that sued you. 50% is the limit for a support order.
But if someone goes to court and convinces a judge to make it different, then it could be different. So
right.
We'll talk about CRA shortly, but as a general rule, federal law trumps provincial law. So Revenue Canada is typically not bound by that 20% limit either. So we'll get back to that. So okay, let's knock through then the different kinds of income that people can receive and ask the question whether or not that could be subject to a garnishment order. And the reason we're doing this show is because one of the main reasons people end up going bankrupt or filing a consumer proposal is, I don't want my wages to be garnished.
Right. They're afraid of what's going to happen. They're having a hard enough time living paycheck to paycheck, and suddenly now part of their paycheck's disappearing.
And so if you have a job and are getting paid wages, then yes, it is very likely, well, not very likely, but it is possible that your wages could be garnished. Right. But other sources of income may or may not be able to be garnished. So if they can't be garnished, maybe you don't need to do a bankruptcy to prevent a garnishment order. Maybe
right.
There's other reasons, but maybe you do. So okay, let's start with Ontario Works, also known as social assistance. Can Ontario Works be garnished?
So by law, it cannot be. Section 23 of the Ontario Works Act says...
So there's a special act that covers this particular thing. Okay.
We're going to throw more laws at you today than everybody
here
wants to hear about. But it basically says that basic financial assistance, which is what Ontario Works, social assistance, welfare checks are, is not subject to alienation or transfer and is not subject to a garnishment, attachment, execution, seizure, or receivership order under any other act. So it basically says that they can't garnish your Ontario Works money.
What if I owe child support and I'm on Ontario Works?
This is where it always gets great. So child support can be taken from any sort of income.
And that's specifically mentioned in the Act, too.
That's right. And it's basically because if someone's been ordered to pay spousal or child support, then presumably that order is based on whatever type of income they had at the time. And the recipient needs that income to maintain a standard of living for the child or the ex-spouse. So
okay.
It's just got to be done.
Okay, so that makes sense then. So Ontario Works cannot be garnisheed except if there is a support order outstanding, then possibly that it could be.
Right.
So then let's go into the next category, which is disability payments. So can a disability pension be garnisheed? Now, there are two common categories, company plans and government plans. So a company plan would be where you have a disability coverage through work. So if you become disabled, the disability insurance plan pays you. So, I mean, in effect, it's a replacement for lost wages because you can't work. So, Ted, the question is, garnishee or no?
So it can be garnisheed. The real critical element here is that it's an insurance plan that you've purchased to replace your wages. It's not a social benefit. So the Act says, for the purpose of this section, payments from an insurance or indemnity scheme that are intended to replace income shall be deemed to be wages. So it's very clear, if you're off work and you're receiving insurance benefits from work, they can be garnisheed.
And that's from the Ontario Wages Act. So that's the way you got to think about it. Disability payments from work are just like wages, really, really no different. So, okay, that's if I have a company disability plan. What if I'm getting my disability payments through a government organization, like, for example, ODSP? So ODSP stands for Ontario Disability Support Program. And, of course, there is an act called the Ontario Disability Support Program Act. What does it say?
All right, so it specifically says in Section 18, income support under this Act, subsection B, is not subject to garnishment, attachment, execution, seizure, or receiver under any other Act. So it cannot be garnisheed.
And same clauses, though, with respect to support orders.
Yes, and there are, and that's going to apply in every case. So I guess we need to make sure that people clearly understand there are execution creditors, people that have sued you that have a right to try and garnish your wages. And then there's orders under the Family Law Act for support. The Family Law Act orders are always going to be able to pursue whatever form of income you have if the court has ordered that you're required to pay support.
So there you go. So to summarize this then, wages can be garnisheed. Disability payments from your employer for lost wages can be garnisheed because they're really just a replacement for wages. Ontario Works and Ontario Disability Support Payments, ODSP, cannot be garnisheed or attached because, as you said, the execution creditors cannot get them, with the exception of support orders for child support or spousal support. And we know all this because we reviewed the Wages Act, the Ontario Works Act, and the Ontario Disability Support Payments Act. So that's more lawyer stuff than we've ever done on this show.
And there's more to come.
More to come, because the final common category that people get is pensions. And yes, of course, there is an Ontario Pension Benefits Act. It's by far the longest of all the acts we've looked at so far. The Wages Act had 8 sections. The Pension Benefits Act has 116 sections. So, Ted, you've read them all. I know you always wanted to be a lawyer when you grow up. How many of those 116 sections in the Ontario Pension Benefits Act deal with garnishments?
Let me think about this. None.
None. So if you get a retirement pension from where you used to work, there is nothing in the legislation that specifically permits a creditor to garnish it. That's good.
That's correct.
Now,
yeah.
There's also federal legislation called the Canada Pension Plan Act. It has 118 sections because, of course, the feds have to have a couple extra sections. How many of those sections deal with wage garnishments?
None.
Good. So the final category of government pensions is the Old Age Security Program, which is the Government of Canada's largest pension program. A lot of people don't know that. So can retirement income be garnisheed? So let's start with OAS. So the Old Age Security Pension, it's a monthly payment. It's available if you're age 65 or older and you meet, your Canadian legal status, meet the residence requirements. You probably have to apply to receive it. Back in 2016, the income threshold was $73,756. So if you earn more than that amount, you don't get the full OAS pension. And in addition to the OAS pension, there are 3 types of OAS benefits. I mean, I don't know how the government could have made this more confusing, but there's the Guaranteed Income Supplement. And so what's the Guaranteed Income Supplement, Ted?
So you live in Canada and you've got a low income. This monthly non-taxable benefit can be added to your OAS pension. Basically, it's topping you up.
It's a top-up. And then there's also an allowance. What's the deal on that one?
So if you're 60 to 64 years old and your spouse is already receiving OAS pension, you may be eligible for the guaranteed income supplement. So it's a top-up if you're the spouse of somebody receiving the pension already.
And you're obviously slightly younger than them. Right. And then there's also something called the allowance for the survivor.
Right. So if you're 60 to 64 years old and you're widowed or a widower, you may be eligible to receive this benefit. The idea is that it'll bridge you until you're eligible for the benefit yourself at 65.
Right. So those last two, the allowance and the allowance for the survivor, obviously disappear when you're 65 because then you're getting the full OAS. So there is, of course, an Old Age Security Act. Fortunately, it's only got 46 sections. So, Ted, is there anything in the Old Age Security Act about garnishments?
Nothing.
Nothing. So OAS can't be garnished by a normal creditor, but your payments can be suspended by the government if you cease to reside in Canada, or if you're in jail, or if your income is too high, but those are not garnishments.
Right.
So, okay, let's talk about some exceptions to all this then. So there's nothing in the legislation that allows a creditor to garnish my CPP or OAS, so that sounds great.
Yep.
But there are 5 cases, at least that I can think of, where you could lose some or all of your government pension. So, Ted, I'm going to say the list, and you just fire in your comments on each one. So, Number 1 exception to the pension rules, pension funds deposited into a bank account where you owe money.
So once the money is deposited into your bank account, it is commingled. So it's no longer pension money, and now it's just your money, and the banks have the right to seize it if you owe the money on one of your other accounts. It's called the right of set-off. So basically, if you owe $500 on your Visa card, you've got $500 in your bank account, wherever that $500 came from, they've got the right to take it if you don't make your payment.
So pretty simple. And that's why we always recommend if you're going through financial trouble, it might not be a bad idea to open a new bank account at a bank where you don't owe money.
It's an excellent way to protect yourself because the banks will do this without telling you.
Because they have the power to do it. So, okay, so the second exception to this rule that says pensions can't be garnished, what if I owe child or spousal support arrears?
Right, so remember we said all along here that if you, spousal support or support orders from the Family Law Act can take up to 50% of your pay. It's usually done by the Family Responsibility Office, which is another government agency. So if you owe support, they can come after your pension too.
And we've certainly seen that happen.
Yes.
Now, I kind of glossed over Revenue Canada in one of the previous segments. So if I get a pension and if I owe money to Canada Revenue Agency, obviously for taxes, what power do they have?
Well, Canada Revenue Agencies, they're power onto themselves. They can do all sorts of things without getting any oversight from anyone else. So no court orders required. They simply send a letter to your bank or to whatever program is offering you the benefit and start garnishing or seize the money.
So they can send a letter to CPP or OAS or whatever and start taking money.
When you think about it, it's the same right of set-off that the other creditors have. It's just that the government is so much more powerful. So if you owe them money for taxes, why would they keep paying you your pension?
And we've actually seen that happen.
Yeah, and it's frustrating for seniors because obviously the folks receiving that pension, it's usually the only form of income that they got. Something horrible has happened, and now they've got the added problem of the government wanting the rest of their money.
Yeah, because if they had other sources of income, the government would be going after that, presumably. So, okay, so category number 4, exceptions to the pension rules, income security overpayments. What are we talking about here?
So if you get a government benefit, think of it like the old age supplement. Another one is the child tax benefit, things like that. If they overpay you or have overpaid you in the past, then they will claw back a portion of your benefit in the future. They don't consider it a garnishee per se. They consider it a clawback or an offset.
But the effect is the same. Instead of me getting $800 a month, now I'm getting $400 a month.
Correct.
If it walks like a garnishment and quacks like a garnishment, it's a garnishment, right?
Yep.
So, and I guess kind of a very similar line, number 5 in the exceptions is social assistance repayments.
Right, so same thing. If you're on Ontario Works or ODSP or any form of social assistance or welfare, if they believe they have overpaid you in the past, then they will claw back a portion of your future benefits to recover that money.
Cool. Okay, now everything we've talked about up to this point, we've been quoting the Act. Ted has spent the last 5 weeks in detailed study reading every single Act. And we'll summarize all this at the end, but there is one more source of income that we haven't talked about, and it's a source that Ted and I have never encountered in real life. and it's not covered by any legislation, so we don't really know what the answer is. But hey, that's never stopped us before. We'll discuss it anyway.
Right.
And that's basic income. So back on show number 114 in November 2016, my guest was David McDonald, a senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. On that show, David described the concept of basic income. And if you're interested in a full explanation, I'll put a link to that show over in the show notes over at hoys.com/podcast. In simple terms, if basic income became widely available, everyone would get a payment each month, whether they are working or not. Now, in 2017, the Ontario government started a pilot project to test basic income. The pilot project is currently operating in Hamilton, Brantford, and Thunder Bay. Participants must have lived in these communities for at least a year and still live there. They must be between 18 and 64 years old. So this isn't for seniors. Obviously, there are other programs for them. And they must have a low income, which is defined as being under $34,000 if you're single or under $48,000 for couples. Participants in this test will receive around $17,000 per year for a single person or $24,000 per year for a couple, less half of any income they earn. People with a disability will receive an extra $500 per month. And I'm not going to get into the mechanics of this and whether it actually makes sense or not. I mean, my comment off the top of my head would be, this doesn't sound like basic income if you're going to have these deductions and so on and so forth.
Right.
But okay, fine. That's the way the way the policy is right now. So here's the question. If you are a member of this pilot project and you're receiving a basic income payment and you have debts, can your basic income payment be garnished by a creditor? And this is a very relevant question because, as we know from our Joe Debtor study, people who file a bankruptcy or a consumer proposal in Ontario have incomes that are around 40% less than the median income in Ontario. So since the participants in the basic income study are people with lower incomes, it is likely that at least some of the participants have debts. So if they owe money on their credit card and don't pay, could the credit card company go to court, get a judgment, and then enforce that judgment by garnishing their monthly basic income check?
And the answer is we just don't know at this point. It hasn't been tested in court yet that we're aware of. It doesn't seem to meet the definition of wages because you haven't earned this income for doing something. I mean, unless you consider being alive a way of earning something.
Wages are defined as an employer is paying you something.
Paying you to
Obviously,
do something.
There is no employer here.
It doesn't appear to be a pension. Right. If anything, it's a government assistance. But unlike Ontario Works or ODSP, there's no specific protection in the legislation. So at this point, we just don't know.
Yeah, and we just don't know. And I've talked to a number of people who are involved in this on many sides of the issue, and this is a very serious concern. The pilot project is something that people sign up for. And so a number of organizations, and I can think of one in Hamilton in particular, have said, we're kind of reluctant to be encouraging people to sign up for this if what we're really doing is giving them income that potentially can be garnished.
Right.
So it's a bit of a worry. So at this point in time, our opinion is there is no specific law that says it cannot be garnished.
Right. So it's really going to come down to the first few test cases in court and the judge's perception of what this law is supposed to do.
And then presumably the government will then pass laws to codify how it should work. Exactly what they've done with OW and ODSP.
One of the reasons this is so important is because people are saying that the basic income is a benefit that will replace a lot of other government programs. And so right now it's in the test phases, but if the government likes the results, they believe it's beneficial to the public and can save them some money somehow, they're going to roll this out in a bigger way. And this is going to become a very important aspect of it.
Yeah, because if everyone had a basic income, you wouldn't need Ontario Works.
Right. Or pensions.
Yeah, I mean, I guess pensions.
Not the old age supplement or the CP.
Yeah, I mean, maybe those go away too, depending on whether at age 65 basic income disappears because there are other programs there. So you're right; they're going to have to figure out what they're going to do if this becomes a thing. And I would assume the government would just put those same clauses that you read from the Ontario Works legislation, the ODSP legislation, and so on.
Can you imagine how annoyed the public would be if suddenly they found out that these supplements were being garnished by creditors? There'd be a revolt.
Yeah, so we come up with basic income to support the banks.
Right. That's what it sounds like.
Which is what it sounds like. So
we'll see.
So stay tuned. We will continue to monitor this very closely, and as we know more, we will report back. Obviously, this pilot project will run for a while, at which point the results will be assessed, and we'll see what happens from there. So, okay, let's get to the meat of it then, and that is, what can you do if your wages are being garnished or about to be garnished? So people now understand what can be garnished, what can't be. Let's take the very simple case where, okay, I've got wages and they're saying they're going to take me to court, they're going to garnish my wages, or it has already started. So Ted, what's the advice you give people in that situation?
Well, so unless you're a lawyer and knowledgeable about this stuff, you need to get some help. I mean, the best advice I can give you is to call a licensed insolvency trustee, because this is what we actually do for a living. You're going to see ads from debt consultants, financial consultants, credit counselors. All these people are trying to sell you something. They're not necessarily going to give you the answer that you're looking for. A licensed insolvency trustee is required by law to describe to your options what you can do to stop the garnishee, to deal with all of your debts.
So if I am being garnished right now, what can I do to stop it?
All right. So the easiest way to stop it is pay off the debt in full. If you could have done that, then obviously
probably would have done it
already. So you can try to negotiate with the creditor, whoever has got the execution against you for the garnishee, and say, look, this is what I'm going to do to help you. If they've gone to the trouble of garnishing your wages, I think they're not going to be very receptive to any kind of deal you're going to offer them at this point.
Because they've already spent the money on the court and everything.
Well, and they only took you to court because you weren't very faithful about paying them for whatever reason in the first place. So you have legal options, though. You have the right to file a consumer proposal, or you could file personal bankruptcy. And we can talk a little bit more about both of those things. It probably makes sense.
Okay, so let's start with personal bankruptcy then. Personal bankruptcy stops a garnishment. Is that correct?
That's right. The only type of garnishment that it will not stop is for support orders. So child support, spousal support, just like all those other exemptions we came across when we were reviewing the 6 or 7 laws in this program, you cannot stop an order for support to somebody else through bankruptcy law. The idea is that you're dividing your income to support your children, your spouse from a previous relationship, and that's protected under the law.
So that doesn't go away. But otherwise, the garnishment will stop. So the process would then be, they come in, they see you, you do up the paperwork. How long does it take to stop a garnishment?
Yeah. So someone that's got all of the information required to put these documents together, we can stop a garnishment in a couple of hours. It can literally be done that quickly. The reality is that we need to contact your employer after you've filed the bankruptcy, give them a notice that's called a stay of proceedings. We also send the same notice through to the court telling everyone, you filed bankruptcy now, you're protected under the law, the garnishee has to stop.
And so part of it depends on your employer. And I know a lot of people say to me, I don't want you contacting my employer. I don't want everyone to know. Yeah, well, unfortunately.
Well, it's already too late because somebody's contacted your employer to garnish your wages. The only way we can stop them is to contact your employer to say, no, you're not allowed to do this anymore. This person's protected under the law.
And so the speed at which we can stop the garnishment is really dependent on the information you can give us. If you work for a big, huge company that has 15 people working in the payroll department, It would be really helpful to know, here is the person who is dealing with my situation. Here's their fax number, their email address, their phone number. They're going to be at work this afternoon.
Well, and you know what I found? The bigger the employer, actually, the longer it can take. Because you need to know in advance that if you're working for a huge company, they probably do their payroll a week and a half ahead of time. And so we will send a notice to stop the garnishee immediately. If they've already processed your next paycheck, it'll come off anyway. Now, the good news of that is they're required by law to send it to us, and we'll help you deal with it as part of the bankruptcy, as opposed to it going off to your creditors and you never seen it again.
So we do what we can to do it as quickly as possible. We can start that process once you have filed your bankruptcy, and we electronically send your bankruptcy to the Office of the Superintendent of Bankruptcy, and we instantly get back, assuming there's no glitches in the system, a certificate of appointment, which is then the piece of paper with the fancy number on it that we need to stop that garnishment.
Yeah, we don't apply to the court to get you protection. It's an automatic provision of the law. As soon as you have filed and we've got that number, and as Doug said, it's all done electronically. It takes like 2 minutes. your protections in place.
So in theory, if you come in to see us at 1 o'clock and, sign all the paperwork, at 1:30 we're pushing the buttons. We've got, at 1:31 in the afternoon, we've got the piece of paper back from the government. If you've given us your employer information already, then, by, in theory, 2 o'clock, we can fax it to them or email it to them, and they can then start the process to stop it. But as Ted said, well, if payroll's already been processed for this Friday, then it may be the next one before you see it stopping coming off your
So
paycheck.
one of the first questions we always ask people is, when is your next pay date? So we can give you an estimate of whether or not, can we get this thing stopped before your next payday, or is it probably too late?
And then from a cash flow point of view what's going to happen.
Yep.
So everything you've said about personal bankruptcy stopping a garnishment, what are the differences between that and a consumer proposal stopping a garnishment?
Well, so the protections under the law are the same. As soon as you file a consumer proposal, the creditor is stayed, which means they have to stop any type of garnishee, any type of enforcement action against you. So the same notices that we sent under the bankruptcy, we're going to send to your employer as part of the consumer proposal. I mean, the difference between the two, bankruptcy you're saying you can't afford to repay any part of your debt. The proposal, you're offering to repay part of it. And we've done whole programs on both of these things. It's a question of your own situation, which one of these solutions makes more sense.
Right. So back to your initial point, come in and see a licensed insolvency trustee.
Right, because nobody else can do these things for you. You can't go see a lawyer to get a bankruptcy filed or a proposal filed. You have to speak to a licensed insolvency trustee.
That's just how it works. Kind of, if you want heart surgery, you have to go to a heart surgeon. That's just kind of how it is. So we encourage everyone who thinks there's a garnishment about to start or is already in that situation, even if it's already started, even if it's been going on for months, we can still stop it.
That's right.
Simple as that. So, excellent. So if you need to stop a wage garnishment, today's podcast is a good place to start, but I also recommend, as we've just said, talking with a licensed trustee about your options. That's our show for today. Full show notes, including a lot of links to all of the different legislation we talked about today and the timestamps on each different topic we talked about. If you want to go back and listen to a specific section, can be found at hoyes.com. That's HOYES.com. And we will have a full transcript at hoyes.com as well. Ted, thanks for being here.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you, and thanks for listening. Until next week, I'm Doug Hoyes. That was Debt Free in 30.
Thanks for listening. That was Debt Free in 30.